All right, let's dive into a case that never gets old. Jack the Ripper. You sent in a podcast episode all about it, and, well, I can see why. It's a mystery that's been keeping people up at night for, what, over a century? And, we're not just going to rehash the facts here. I've got an expert with us who can really help us unpack this whole thing, what makes it so fascinating, so intriguing, even after all these years.
Yeah, I think for me, the most striking thing about Jack the Ripper is what it tells us about the underbelly of Victorian society. It's not just about a killer running loose, it's about a society wrestling with all this massive change, poverty, and just how vulnerable some groups were back then.
You're so right. And the podcast you sent, it paints such a vivid picture of that Victorian London, right? All this groundbreaking innovation and extravagant wealth, but then you have this stark contrast of just crushing poverty. And Whitechapel, where all these murders took place, well, becomes a character in its own right.
It does. It really does. Imagine Whitechapel in 1888. I mean, just a maze of overcrowded slums, crime, desperation everywhere. It's not just a backdrop. It really shaped the entire Jack the Ripper narrative.
It makes you think, doesn't it? How a place can shape events, but also how we understand them. So let's talk about those first murders. The podcast mentions Mary Ann Polly Nichols and Annie Chapman, both brutally murdered in August of 1888. And, these weren't just murders. They really shook London to its core.
Well, the brutality was definitely a part of it, no doubt. But the real terror came from the precision of the mutilations. This wasn't just random violence. It suggested some level of anatomical knowledge. That wasn't common. People immediately started speculating, was it a doctor, a butcher, and all that mystery? Well, it fueled the fear.
And then, of course, the media frenzy kicks in, and you've got this unknown killer turned into this almost legendary figure. And that name, Jack the Ripper, it came from a letter sent to the Central News Agency. And to this day, we still don't know for sure who wrote it.
The Dear Boss letter, yeah. That's just one of many letters that muddy the waters of this whole investigation. Some experts think it's a real message from the killer, like a chilling glimpse into his mind. Others say it's a hoax, just someone trying to stir up more fear.
And that fear was real, especially for the women living in Whitechapel. The podcast focuses on what are they called? The canonical 5 victims. The 5 murders most likely committed by Jack the Ripper. Polly Nichols and Annie Chapman, who we talked about, but also Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. And each murder, it adds a whole new layer of complexity to the mystery.
And what's so interesting is how different the details are in each murder, almost as if the killer was, evolving. Take Elizabeth Stride, for example. Hers is unique because only her throat was cut. It makes you think, was he interrupted? Did something make him run before he could do, well, what he usually did?
It's a question that's haunted investigators for years, hasn't it? Makes you think about how chance plays a role in all of this. But then, just an hour later, you have the murder of Catherine Eddowes. And the violence, it escalates dramatically. Now you have organ removal, something that wasn't there in the previous murders.
And it all culminates with Mary Jane Kelly's murder in November of that same year. And the podcast doesn't shy away from those gruesome details. And I think that's important because it forces us to see the real horror of these crimes. The mutilation was so extensive, it really painted this picture of a killer just consumed by rage.
It's like each murder, it gave him more confidence, more boldness. But let's switch gears for a minute. Those letters, the ones claiming to be from Jack himself, did any of them ever get authenticated? You mentioned the Dear Boss letter, but there were others, right?
Oh, definitely. There was the Saucy Jackie postcard, for instance. It chillingly referenced the double murder of Stride and Eddowes. And then you've got the infamous From Hell letter. And that one is especially disturbing. It came with a piece of a human kidney.
A kidney? Oh, that gives me chills. I can only imagine how that just sent the city into even more panic. Did these letters help or hurt the investigation, though?
Well, that's something ripperologists still debate today, those who really dedicate themselves to studying the case. But there's no denying they had an impact. Public hysteria went through the roof. And it definitely complicated things for the police. Think about it. You're trying to sift through real clues, and suddenly you're flooded with all these letters. Some may be genuine, others obviously fake.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle, but someone keeps swapping out the pieces.
Exactly. And all this is happening in 1888. Way before the fancy forensic tech we have today.
I can't imagine the pressure those investigators were under. Trying to solve a case like this with limited resources, a terrified public breathing down your neck, and the media just whipping everyone into a frenzy. No wonder he was never caught.
The podcast mentions over 2,000 people were interviewed, and something like 80 suspects were detained. But no arrests were ever made. The sheer chaos of Whitechapel, combined with the limited forensic technology they had back then, made it an almost impossible task.
It really shows you that even with everyone's best efforts, sometimes justice just slips away.
It does. And that's part of what makes this case so fascinating. Even after all this time, we're drawn to the mystery, to the idea that there are things we may never truly know. And it's like he just vanished, leaving behind all these questions and a city forever marked by his crimes.
Yeah, that sudden silence, it adds another layer to the whole thing.
Some people say he died, others think he left the country, even that he just stopped killing. But even without a clear end to the murders, the impact was huge. This case didn't just end, it grew into something so much bigger.
You're right. When we think about Jack the Ripper's legacy, it's way more than just those horrific murders. It's how it changed London, how it changed the way we investigate crime, and how it still shapes how we see human nature.
Let's start with London itself. This case ripped the lid off the inequality that was bubbling under the surface of Victorian society. Whitechapel, already a symbol of hardship, it became synonymous with fear and vulnerability.
The podcast mentions how after the Ripper, there was this new push for social reform, especially in places like Whitechapel. It's like the city was forced to face the harsh reality that had been festering there.
Exactly. The Ripper's crimes exposed those desperate conditions. They forced people to see the struggles of those living in the margins. It wasn't just about catching a killer anymore. It was about fixing the system that allowed such darkness to thrive.
And for women, especially those living in poverty, the Ripper's shadow hung over them long after the murders ended. They were the most vulnerable, and this case tragically showed the dangers they faced.
Absolutely. The Jack the Ripper case started important discussions about women's safety, their place in society, and the need for more protection, especially for the most vulnerable. And, it's a conversation that, sadly, we're still having today.
Yeah, it's true. And another area where the Ripper's impact can't be denied is in criminal investigation. You mentioned how the lack of, good forensics back in 1888 really hindered the investigation.
Imagine the frustration of those investigators. They were dealing with this brutal, seemingly random killer, and the tools they had were so limited. Fingerprint analysis was barely a thing, DNA evidence was unheard of, and criminal profiling, well, that was more art than science back then. But the Ripper case kind of forced the field to grow.
It was like necessity is the mother of invention, right?
Yeah.
The desperate need to catch this killer, it pushed people to find better ways to analyze crime scenes, collect evidence, and, develop criminal profiling.
Exactly. Think about it. Today, we just expect forensic science. We see it on TV, read about it in books, but back then it was just starting out. And the Ripper case, as horrible as it was, it pushed those investigators to think differently, to find new ways to understand and track criminals.
So in a way, those advancements we benefit from today in forensic science.
What's up?
We kind of owe them to those gruesome murders in Whitechapel.
It's a dark connection, but yeah. The Ripper, without meaning to, he became this catalyst for change in criminal investigation. The need to solve his case to finally bring him to justice, it spurred advancements that would end up changing countless investigations for the better.
Okay, so we've talked about his impact on social reform, women's safety, the development of forensics, but there's another piece I'm really curious about. Why are we, even after all this time, so fascinated by Jack the Ripper? What is it about this case that still has such a hold on us?
The million-dollar question. And I think there are a few layers to this enduring fascination. For one, there's just the pure mystery of it. An unsolved case, especially one that's brutal and high profile, it just grabs us. It makes us want answers. We crave that resolution. And when we don't get it, well, the case takes on a life of its own in our minds.
It's like this puzzle we just have to solve, even if some pieces are gone forever.
Exactly. And it's not just about finding out who he was. It's about understanding his why, his methods, his mind. We want to peel back the layers to make sense of something that doesn't make sense. And because we can't fully do that, well, it makes the case even more captivating.
I think you're onto something else here, too. It's not just the mystery itself. It's the whole historical context, isn't it? The Victorian era has this unique pull for people. It was a time of such rapid change, so much happening, those stark contrasts between wealth and poverty. There's a kind of romance to it, but also this air of mystery.
You got it. The Victorian era with its gas lamps, fog everywhere, horse-drawn carriages, it's like the perfect setting for this macabre drama. And then you have Jack the Ripper lurking in the shadows. He becomes this symbol of the era's allure, but also its anxieties.
He embodies that darker side of progress, that feeling that even when things are moving forward, danger can still be right around the corner.
Exactly. And that takes us to another layer of the fascination, the psychological element. Jack the Ripper, he represents this darkness in humanity, this capacity for evil that we all have to face, whether we like it or not. And exploring his story, trying to figure out what made him tick, it lets us grapple with those uncomfortable truths in a safe way, almost detached.
Like watching a horror movie, you know? We get that thrill of fear, the excitement of the unknown, but we're not actually in danger.
That's a great way to put it. We can analyze, theorize, even try to put ourselves in the killer's shoes, all from a safe distance. And maybe by doing that, we learn something about ourselves, about good and evil, about that thin line between civilization and, well, chaos.
Like a warning, right?
Oh,
A
yeah.
reminder that the darkness we see in the Ripper, it can exist anywhere, even in us.
Exactly. And that brings us back to why this case is still so powerful. It's not just about solving a crime, it's about confronting the darkness within us all, understanding how complex human nature is, and accepting that some mysteries might never be truly solved.
You know, we've talked a lot about the Ripper, the investigation, the social and historical context. But we can't forget that the heart of this story is the victims. It's easy to get lost in the mystery, the hunt for the killer. But we can't forget that these were real women whose lives were taken from them.
You're absolutely right. It's easy to get swept up in it all. But in our quest to understand the killer, we must never forget the human cost. Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. Their names deserve to be remembered, their stories honored. They weren't just victims, they were people with lives, with families.
And it's their stories that remind us that behind every true crime case, behind every headline, there are real people who suffered. And in this case, their deaths also revealed the weaknesses in society that allowed this to happen.
It's a sobering thought, isn't it? While we can analyze the Ripper's methods and motives, we also need to look at the social conditions that made these women vulnerable in the first place. Poverty, lack of opportunity, societal prejudices, they all played a part in their tragic fate.
Yeah, it's like we get so caught up in the shadows, the mystery of it all, that we forget about the real people who were lost.
Absolutely. It's a trap that's easy to fall into with true crime. It becomes this puzzle to solve. But these are real stories with real people. We need to remember that and approach them with empathy, with respect for those victims. Their lives, their struggles, their hopes and dreams, those are the things that ground this whole narrative. The things that remind us of what these crimes really meant.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Jack the Ripper, what would you say is the main takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about after this?
Well, it's more than just a whodunit, right? It's a glimpse into Victorian society, a cautionary tale about vulnerability, and a story that makes us face the darkness that exists in humanity. It reminds us that history isn't just dates and facts, it's about people and the consequences of their actions.
And even though we might never know for sure who Jack the Ripper was, exploring this case, well, it gives us so much to think about. The advancements in forensics, the conversation about women's safety, the inequalities of the time. It's a legacy that's still felt today.
Exactly. The search for answers, even when they seem impossible to find, it can lead us to incredible discoveries and a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world we live in.
We want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive. And as you reflect on this case, I want you to consider this. How different would our understanding of Jack the Ripper be if these crimes happened today? With DNA evidence, cameras everywhere, instant communication around the globe, would we have caught him? Would the mystery still captivate us the same way? It's something to think about, isn't it? The Jack the Ripper case, it really drives home the point that some mysteries might never be fully solved. But exploring them, digging into the unknown, it can teach us so much about who we are, both as individuals and as a society, both in the past and the present.